Rashomon. It was late one afternoon. A servant was waiting for the rain to stop under the Rashomon gate. Aside from the man, there was no one else beneath the wide gate. Only a cricket clung to one of the large pillars, whose red lacquer had peeled off in places. Given that Rashomon stood along Suzaku Avenue, it would not have been surprising to see 2 or 3 others wearing straw hats or wrinkled eboshi caps also taking shelter from the rain. But there was no one else. The reason for this was that over the past 2 or 3 years, disasters such as earthquakes, whirlwinds, fires and famine had continuously struck Kyoto. The city's desolation was no ordinary affair. According to old records, people would smash Buddhist statues and ritual objects, and pile up the wood, still coated with red lacquer or gold and silver leaf, by the roadside to sell as firewood. With the city in such a state, no one had bothered to repair Rashomon. Eventually, foxes and raccoons moved into the ruins, followed by thieves. Finally, the gate became a dumping ground for unclaimed corpses. As a result, when night fell, people were afraid to go near the gate. Instead, crows gathered in large numbers from who knows where. During the day, they would circle around the high shibi, decorative roof finials, crying as they flew. Especially when the sky above the gate turned red at sunset, they could be clearly seen, like scattered sesame seeds. The crows came, of course, to peck at the flesh of the corpses on the gate. Today, however, perhaps because it was late, not a single crow was in sight. Only white spots of bird droppings could be seen dotting the crumbling stone steps, overgrown with long grass in the cracks. The servant sat on the topmost of the 7 steps, absently watching the rain while worrying about a large pimple on his right cheek. Earlier, the author wrote that the servant was waiting for the rain to stop. However, even if the rain did stop, the servant had no particular place to go. Normally, of course, he would return to his master's house. But 4 or 5 days ago, his master had dismissed him. As mentioned earlier, Kyoto was in a state of decline, and the servant had been let go due to the ripple effects of this widespread desolation. So, rather than waiting for the rain to stop, it would be more accurate to say that the servant was trapped by the rain, with no place to go and no idea what to do. Moreover, today's gloomy weather had only deepened the servant's melancholy. The rain, which had begun in the hour of the monkey, around 4 o'clock to 6 p.m., showed no sign of letting up. The servant, with nothing else to do, pondered how to survive tomorrow, trying, in vain, to find some solution, as he half listened to the sound of rain falling on Suzaku Avenue. The rain surrounded Rashomon, bringing a distant rumble. The sky grew steadily darker, and when he looked up, the roof of the gate jutted out, its tiles seeming to support the weight of the heavy, dark clouds. To survive in such circumstances, one could not afford to be picky about the means. Hesitation would lead only to starving on the roadside or under some wall. And in the end, your corpse would be dumped here at this gate, like a stray dog. If you didn't want that fate. The servant's thoughts kept circling around this point. But no matter how much he thought about it, the answer remained elusive. Even as he convinced himself that he could no longer afford to choose his methods, he could not summon the courage to take the next logical step, to become a thief. The servant sneezed loudly and then stood up with an air of fatigue. The evening cold of Kyoto was such that even a brazier would have been welcome. The wind blew freely through the gaps between the pillars, along with the gathering dusk. The cricket that had clung to the red lacquered pillar had disappeared. The servant hunched his shoulders, shrinking his neck into his yellow undergarment, and pulling up the collar of his blue outer robe as he glanced around the gate. He was looking for a place where he could spend the night, out of the rain and wind, and where he wouldn't be disturbed. Then, by chance, his eyes fell on the wide, red-lacquered ladder leading up to the second floor of the gate. If he went up there, he figured, the only company would be the dead. Being careful not to let the sacred hilted sword at his waist clatter in its scabbard, the servant placed a straw-sandaled foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. After a few minutes, the servant was crouching like a cat on the middle rung of the wide ladder, holding his breath as he peered upward. A faint light flickered on his right cheek, which was dotted with a large, pus-filled pimple. From the beginning, the servant had assumed that only corpses would be up there. But as he climbed a few rungs, he saw that someone was moving a light around above him. This was apparent because the murky yellow light swayed across the cobwebbed ceiling beams. Given that someone was lighting a fire on this rainy night in the deserted Rashomon gate, it was unlikely to be an ordinary person. The servant, careful to keep his footsteps silent like a gecko, crept to the top of the steep ladder. Pressing his body as flat as possible, he craned his neck forward and cautiously peered into the upper floor. Inside, as rumored, there were several corpses scattered about carelessly. But the fire's light didn't reach far, so it was impossible to tell how many. All that was clear was that there were both naked and clothed corpses, and they seemed to include both men and women. The corpses, lying sprawled on the floor with their mouths gaping and limbs outstretched, seemed more like clay dolls than once living humans. The firelight dimly illuminated the higher parts of the corpses, leaving the lower parts in deep shadow, as they lay in eternal silence. The servant instinctively covered his nose at the smell of rot, but in the next moment, he forgot to shield his nose. A powerful emotion had nearly overwhelmed his sense of smell. For the first time, the servant noticed a human figure crouched among the corpses. It was an old woman, small and scrawny like a monkey, with grey hair and wearing a dark brown robe. In her right hand, she held a lit pinewood stick, which she was using to peer closely at one of the corpses. Judging by the long hair, it appeared to be a woman's body. The servant, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, forgot to breathe for a moment. To borrow the words of an old chronicler, even the hair on his head and body stood on end. The old woman then wedged the pinewood stick between the floorboards. After that, she put both hands on the corpse's neck and, just like a mother monkey picking lice from her child, began pulling out the long strands of hair one by one. The hair seemed to come out easily. As each strand of hair came loose, the servant's fear gradually faded, replaced by a growing sense of intense hatred for the old woman. Or rather, it might be more accurate to say that his revulsion for all forms of evil steadily grew. If someone had at that moment asked him again whether he would rather starve to death or become a thief, he would likely have chosen starvation without hesitation. Such was the fire of his anger that it blazed like the pinewood stick the old woman had thrust into the floorboards. The servant naturally didn't understand why the old woman was pulling out the hair of a dead person. Thus, he couldn't rationally judge whether it was good or evil. However, to the servant, the mere act of pulling out the hair of the dead atop Rashomon on this rainy night was already an unforgivable evil. Of course, he had long forgotten that just moments ago, he was contemplating becoming a thief. With that, the servant gathered his strength in his legs and suddenly leapt up from the ladder. Grasping the hilt of his sword, he strode toward the old woman with long strides. Needless to say, the old woman was startled. Upon seeing the servant, the old woman jumped as if she had been shot from a catapult. "Where do you think you're going?" The servant blocked the path of the old woman, who was stumbling over the corpses in her haste to flee, and hurled these words at her. Even so, the old woman tried to push past the servant to escape. The servant, not allowing her to leave, pushed her back. The two of them grappled silently among the corpses for a while. But the outcome was obvious from the start. In the end, the servant grabbed the old woman's arm and forcibly twisted her down. Her arm was as thin and frail as a chicken's leg, just skin and bones. "What were you doing? Speak. If you don't talk, this is what you'll get." The servant released the old woman and swiftly drew his sword, brandishing the white steel in front of her eyes. However, the old woman remained silent. Her hands trembled violently, her shoulders heaved with labored breaths, and her eyes, so wide they seemed ready to pop out of their sockets, stared at him in stubborn silence, like that of a mute. Seeing this, the servant suddenly realized that the old woman's life was entirely in his hands. This realization quickly cooled the anger that had been burning within him. What was left was nothing but a calm satisfaction and contentment, like when a task is successfully completed. So, while looking down at the old woman, the servant softened his voice and said, "I'm not an officer of the law. I'm just a traveler who happened to pass by this gate. So, I don't intend to tie you up or anything like that. I just want to know what you were doing up here on this gate. If you tell me, that's all I need." At this, the old woman's already wide-open eyes grew even larger as she stared fixedly at the servant's face. Her eyelids, reddened like those of a bird of prey, sharpened her gaze. Then, moving her lips, so wrinkled they were nearly one with her nose, as if chewing on something, her thin throat showed the movement of her pointed Adam's apple. At that moment, a voice, hoarse like a crow's caw, rasped its way to the servant's ears. "I was pulling out this hair. Pulling out this hair. To make a wig." The servant was disappointed at how mundane the old woman's answer was. And as his disappointment set in, the cold contempt that accompanied his previous hatred crept back into his heart. Perhaps sensing this change in his demeanor, the old woman, still clutching the long strands of hair she had pulled from the corpse's head, began mumbling in a croaking voice, almost like a frog. "True, pulling out a dead person's hair may be bad. But all these corpses here, they were all people who deserved it. The woman I just pulled the hair from, for instance, used to cut a snake into 4-inch pieces, dry it, and sell it as dried fish to the soldiers. If she hadn't died of the plague, she'd probably still be doing it. The soldiers used to say it tasted good and bought it as a regular part of their meals. I don't think what she did was wrong. She had to do it to keep from starving. That's why I don't think what I'm doing is wrong either. I have to do it to avoid starving. So, I'm sure this woman, who knew the desperation of such actions, would be understanding of what I'm doing as well." The old woman spoke in such a manner. The servant, having sheathed his sword, calmly listened to the old woman's story while pressing down on the hilt with his left hand. Of course, with his right hand, he absent-mindedly fiddled with the large pimple on his cheek. But as he listened, a certain kind of courage began to well up within him. It was the courage that had been lacking when he stood beneath the gate earlier. And it was a courage entirely different from the one he had when he climbed up and seized the old woman. The servant was no longer torn between starving to death or becoming a thief. In his mind now, The thought of starving had been so completely cast aside that it was no longer even conceivable. Is that so? When the old woman finished her story, the servant sneered and repeated the question. Then, taking a step forward, he suddenly let go of the pimple he had been picking at, grabbed the old woman by the collar, and snarled at her. "Well then, I suppose you won't mind if I rob you. After all, I have to do this or I'll starve too." The servant swiftly tore the kimono from the old woman's back. As she clung desperately to his legs, he kicked her violently onto the corpses. The ladder was only 5 steps away. Grabbing the chestnut-colored kimono, the servant descended the steep ladder into the darkness of the night in an instant. The old woman, who had lain motionless like a dead body, eventually stirred and raised her naked body from the pile of corpses. Groaning in pain, she crawled toward the base of the ladder, guided by the faint flicker of firelight. Then, with her short, white hair hanging down, she peered out from the gate into the night below. Outside, there was only an endless abyss of darkness. No one knows where the servant went after that.